Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. Now, I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited. Regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you. Mostly 2-3 pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or two. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel, and even a few wahoo over the years, but I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf, majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The Sea Serpent started to list to one side as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. All right, I muttered to myself. Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited. I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. But if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy, or the bragging rights, or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now, the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. "Maybe I am," I said, "but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right." Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that live there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then, with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. This one's a doozy. Happened back in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. You probably know all about Katrina, but you ain't heard it quite like this. Not from a man who was right smack dab in the thick of it. Now, I'd been fishing these Louisiana waters for over 45 years then. Knew every little nook and cranny of the bayou, every ripple in the Gulf, every dang gull's cry. My boat, she's called the Sea Serpent, a sturdy old girl, built for work, not looks. She's seen her share of storms, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared her or me for Katrina. I remember it like it was yesterday. The radio crackled with warnings for days leading up to it. The weatherman kept saying catastrophic, unprecedented, words that made your gut clench. Most folks evacuated, headed north, inland. But me, I was stubborn, always have been. My house, my life was by the water. I figured I could ride it out. I'd seen hurricanes before, plenty of them. I battened down the hatches, stocked up on supplies, and figured I'd hunker down with the Sea Serpent in a sheltered inlet near Cocodrie, wait for the storm to pass. Biggest mistake I ever made. The storm hit with a fury I couldn't have imagined. The wind, it wasn't just blowing, it was screaming, tearing at everything. The rain felt like needles pounding against the boat. The waves, Lord, the waves. They weren't waves, they were mountains of water, crashing over the Sea Serpent, threatening to swallow her whole. The little inlet I thought would protect me, useless. It became a raging torrent. The Sea Serpent, bless her heart, she held strong. But I was fighting a losing battle. The wind ripped away parts of the cabin. The anchor lines snapped like a twig, and I was adrift, tossed around like a cork in a bathtub. For hours, it was just me, the Sea Serpent in the storm. I clung to the wheel, battling to keep her afloat, praying to anyone who would listen. I remember thinking this was it, the end of old Jerry. I was tired, soaked to the bone, and scared beyond anything I'd ever felt. Then through the blinding rain and spray, I saw it, a light, a faint flickering light. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but it was there, bobbing on the water's surface. As I fought to steer the Sea Serpent closer, I realized it was a house, or at least what was left of one. The house, or what was left, was barely afloat. It had been ripped from its foundations and was being tossed around like a child's toy. On its roof, clinging for dear life, were people. 3 of them. A young woman, a teenage boy, and an elderly man who looked to be in his 80s. My heart lurched. I knew I had to help, but getting close to that house in this storm was suicide. It was like trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. But those terrified faces, I couldn't leave them to die. I wrestled with the Sea Serpent, inching closer, battling the waves, the wind, the rain. It felt like an eternity. Every time a wave crashed over the boat, I thought it would be the end. But I kept going, driven by something bigger than myself. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I was close enough. "Hold on," I yelled, my voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "I'm going to get you." The young woman looked at me, her face pale with fear. She nodded, her eyes pleading. The boy looked dazed, clinging to her arm. The old man, he just stared, his eyes hollow. Now here's the tricky part. Getting them off that crumbling house and onto the Sea Serpent wasn't going to be easy. One wrong move, and we'd all be in the drink. I had a rope ladder, thank goodness, but even getting it close enough was a challenge. I maneuvered the sea serpent as close as I dared, fighting to keep her steady. "Throw the ladder," I yelled. The woman, bless her heart, had the presence of mind to help. I saw her grab the ladder as best she could and try to hold on to it. The first one to come across was the boy. He was scared stiff, his limbs shaking, but he was young, agile. I talked him through it, telling him where to put his feet, how to hold on. He made it, collapsing onto the deck of the sea serpent, sobbing with relief. Next was the young woman. She was stronger than she looked, but the waves were relentless, trying to sweep her away. I reached out, grabbed her hand, and hauled her aboard. She collapsed beside the boy, hugging him tight. Now, the old man. He was frail, weak. I knew this would be the hardest. He could barely stand on the roof, let alone climb down a rope ladder in a hurricane. I had to think fast. I couldn't risk him falling. I tied a rope around myself, secured the other end to the sea serpent, and, against my better judgment, jumped onto the roof of the house. It was worse than I imagined. The roof was slick, the wind was tearing at me, and the house was tilting precariously. I crawled over to the old man, who looked at me with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "All right, Pop," I said. "We're going to get you out of here. You just hold on tight to me." I wrapped my arms around him, trying to shield him from the wind and rain. Then, inch by agonizing inch, I started to move him towards the edge of the roof. Every step was a struggle. The wind tried to rip us apart. The waves threatened to wash us away. I could feel the house creaking beneath us, ready to give way at any moment. But I kept going, driven by the sheer will to save this man's life. Finally, we reached the edge of the roof. I managed to grab the rope ladder and secure it to the house. "Now, Pop," I said, my voice hoarse, "you just got to trust me. We're going to go down this ladder together." He nodded, his eyes locked on mine. I started to climb down, holding him tight against me. It was slow, torturous work. The waves crashed over us. The wind howled in our ears. But we kept going, one step at a time. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the deck of the sea serpent. The young woman and the boy rushed to help us. They eased the old man down, wrapped him in blankets, and led him to the small cabin. I collapsed beside them, exhausted but alive. We were safe, at least for the moment. But the storm was far from over. We were still adrift, at the mercy of the elements. The radio was dead, no way to call for help. I knew I had to find some kind of shelter, some place where we could ride out the rest of the storm. But where? Everything was underwater, destroyed. Then I remembered a place, a small, abandoned fishing shack on a tiny island a few miles west. It was rickety, but it was the only chance we had. I fired up the sea serpent's engine and pointed her towards the west. The journey was treacherous. The waves were still huge, the wind still fierce. But I battled on, guided by my knowledge of the waters and the unwavering hope that we could make it. It was a slow, arduous journey. The sea serpent groaned and shuddered, every part of her strained to its limit. Miraculously, we did make it. The fishing shack was still standing, barely. It was a small, one-room structure, battered and worn, but it was dry. We huddled inside, soaked and shivering, but grateful to be alive. The storm raged for another day. We huddled together, sharing stories, trying to keep each other's spirits up. The storm seemed to go on, and a few times we wondered if we were going to make it out alive. We ate what little food I had, rationed it out, and prayed for the storm to end. The old man was weak, but seemed to be holding out. The young woman never stopped trying to keep spirits high, and was a tremendous help in a difficult situation. The boy was thankful to be alive. Finally, on the morning of the third day, the storm began to abate. The wind died down, the rain stopped, and the clouds began to break. The sun peeked through, casting a golden glow over the ravaged landscape. We ventured out cautiously. The scene was one of utter devastation. Everything was underwater. Houses were ripped apart. Trees were uprooted. The world we knew was gone, but we were alive. And that was all that mattered. Then we started to work together to try and salvage what we can. Thankfully, there was a two-way radio in the shack. Soon after, the Coast Guard found us, or more accurately, heard what we were saying from the radio, and we were lifted onto a helicopter and taken to safety. The weeks that followed were a blur of rescue efforts, relief work, and rebuilding. I helped as much as I could, using the Sea Serpent to ferry supplies and transport people. The Sea Serpent became a symbol of hope in the midst of despair. I never saw the young woman, the boy, or the old man again, but I often think about them. I wonder what happened to them, where they ended up. I hope they found happiness, a new life, after all they went through. Katrina changed me, son. It showed me the power of nature, the fragility of life, and the importance of community. It taught me that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. It also taught me the resilience of the human spirit, the incredible ability to endure even the most unimaginable hardships. The world, I learned, is not just divided into black and white, but sometimes it's about people helping each other out and trying to survive. And you know what? Even after all these years, whenever a storm is brewing, I think back to Katrina. I think about those three faces, those terrified eyes, and I know that I did the right thing. I know that even in the face of unimaginable danger, it's always worth it to help someone in need. That's my Katrina story, son. A story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Now, let me get you another glass of iced tea. This old man's throat is dry. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. You see these weathered hands? They've hauled in a lot of fish in my 68 years, but they've also felt things, unseen things. I was a younger man then, maybe pushing 23, full of vinegar, and convinced I knew everything there was to know about the Santee, Cooper lakes. My daddy taught me everything he knew, and his daddy before him. We were river rats, born and bred, lived and breathed the water. But the Santee Cooper ain't just water, son. It's history, it's mystery, it's something else entirely. This particular night, I was down at the old pier by Utahville. It was a rickety thing even then, mostly patched together with old tires and hope, but it stretched out far enough into the Black River to reach the deep holes where the big catfish like to lurk. I was after a flathead, a true monster, one that could feed a family for a week. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to you like a wet blanket. The moon was barely a sliver, hiding behind scudding clouds. The only light came from my gas lantern, casting a sickly yellow glow on the water around the pier. The crickets were singing their monotonous song, and the bullfrogs were croaking like grumpy old men. It was a perfect night for fishing, a night you could feel in your bones was going to produce something special. I had my gear all set up, a sturdy old rod my daddy had given me, a reel that whined like a lovesick dog, and a line strong enough to haul a car out of the mud. For bait, I had a live bream, wriggling on the hook like it knew its fate. I cast it out as far as I could, the line singing a little tune in the night air. Then I waited. Now I'd spent countless nights alone on that pier or on the river. Never bothered me none. I knew the sounds of the night, the rustling of the palmetto leaves, the hooting of the owls, the splash of a fish jumping. But this night was different. There was a stillness, a silence that was heavier than the humidity. The crickets stopped chirping. The bullfrogs went quiet. Even the wind held its breath. It was like the whole world was listening, waiting for something. That's when I saw it. Out of the darkness, about 50 yards downriver, a light began to glow. It wasn't harsh like a flashlight or the beam of a car. It was soft, ethereal, like the light from a firefly, but bigger, more intense. It flickered and danced just above the water, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. I knew in my gut this wasn't no ordinary light. This was something else, something ancient. The light started to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. It moved towards me, along the surface of the water, leaving a shimmering trail in its wake. The closer it got, the colder the air became. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms. My mind raced. Was it a boat? Some kind of swamp gas? I tried to rationalize it, but deep down I knew this was no earthly thing. As the light got closer, I started to hear a sound, a low, mournful hum, like the wind whistling through a hollow tree. It grew louder and louder, vibrating in my bones, filling my head with a sense of dread. Then it was right in front of the pier. The light pulsed, illuminating the water below, and that's when I saw it. Beneath the light, rising from the depths of the black river, was a figure. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, indistinct. It was made of water and light, shimmering and swirling, constantly changing. Its eyes were 2 points of intense burning light, and they were fixed on me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot like a cypress knee. I could only stare as the figure rose higher and higher out of the water. It reached a height of maybe 7 or 8 feet, towering over me. The humming intensified, and I felt a pressure in my head, a feeling of being probed, examined. It felt like the figure was looking into my soul. Then it spoke, not with a voice, not in words I could understand. It was more like a thought, a feeling, projected directly into my mind. "This is my domain," it said. "You trespass upon my waters." The words weren't spoken, but I understood them perfectly. And with them came a wave of overwhelming sadness, a sense of deep, ancient sorrow. I realized then what I was seeing. It wasn't just some random ghost or spook. It was a river spirit, a guardian of these waters. and it was not happy to see me. I managed to stammer out a reply, my voice trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I was just fishing. The figure remained silent for a moment, its luminous eyes still fixed on me. Then it spoke again. "These waters hold memories," it said. "Memories of joy and sorrow, of life and death. You must respect them." I nodded frantically, desperate to appease the spirit. "I do, sir. I do respect them. You seek to take life," it said. "But do you understand the cost?" I didn't know what to say. I'd never thought about it that way before. I'd always just seen fishing as a way to put food on the table, a way to connect with nature. But now, standing before this ancient spirit, I felt a pang of guilt. I don't know, I admitted. The figure seemed to consider this. Then it said, "I will let you be. But remember this night. Remember the respect these waters deserve." And with that, the light began to fade. The figure slowly sank back into the black river, disappearing into the depths from whence it came. The humming subsided, and the cold air began to warm. The crickets started chirping again. The bullfrogs resumed their croaking. The wind whispered through the palmetto leaves. The world returned to normal, but I was not the same. I stood there on the pier for a long time, shaking like a leaf. I reeled in my line, cut the bream loose, and packed up my gear. I didn't want to catch any fish that night. I didn't want to take anything from the river. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced back at the water. The moon was still hidden behind the clouds, but I could almost feel the presence of the river spirit, watching me, reminding me of the lesson I had learned. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Who would believe me? They'd just think I was crazy, spending too much time alone in the woods. But I couldn't forget it. The memory of the river spirit, the feeling of its presence, the weight of its words, it stayed with me. The next day I went back to the pier, but this time I didn't bring my fishing gear. I just sat there on the edge of the water, listening to the sounds of the river. I tried to understand what the spirit had meant about the memories and the respect. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time observing the river than fishing in it. I watched the birds, the otters, the turtles. I studied the way the water flowed, the way the sunlight danced on its surface. I learned about the history of the area, the stories of the Native Americans who had lived here for centuries, the battles that had been fought along its banks. I began to see the river not just as a place to catch fish, but as a living, breathing entity, a repository of history and memory. And I realized that the spirit was right. These waters deserved respect. Now I still fish. It's in my blood, I can't help it. But I fish differently now. I'm more mindful of the impact I have on the environment. I release more fish than I keep. I try to leave the river cleaner than I found it. And sometimes, when I'm out on the water at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A light flickering on the surface, a ripple that doesn't seem quite natural. And I'll remember that night on the pier, and I'll say a silent prayer of thanks to the river spirit for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. That night changed me, son. It taught me that there's more to this world than what we can see and touch. It taught me to respect the power of nature, the wisdom of the old ways, and the importance of listening to the voices of the past. So, The next time you're out on the water, remember old Jerry's story. Respect the river. Listen to the silence. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the whisper of the river spirit too. You might just learn something you never expected. And always remember, son, those are the best kinds of stories. The kind that make you believe. The kind that make you think. The kind that stay with you long after the embers have died down and the fire's gone out. Now, get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll go fishing. But remember what I told you. Respect the river. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. See, I've always been drawn to the legend of Old Man Tiber. Now, I'm not talking about a person. Old Man Tiber was the name local folk gave to this massive mythical catfish that supposedly lived in the darkest depths of the Mississippi River, way down south near the Louisiana border. Folks said he was bigger than a rowboat, with whiskers like mooring ropes and a temper to match. Most dismissed it as just a tall tale, something to scare kids away from the river's edge. But I always held a healthy dose of respect and a sliver of belief for the old legends. Back then I was younger, stronger, and a whole heap braver or maybe dumber, depending on how you look at it. I had this little 16-foot aluminum boat, the Salty Siren, I called her. She wasn't much to look at, but she was reliable, and she knew the river like the back of my hand. Me and that boat, we were partners. So the summer of '92 was especially hot and dry. The river was low, and the fish were sluggish. I was catching enough to keep my head above water, but nothing spectacular. But something was different that year. The old-timers, the ones who'd been fishing the Mississippi their whole lives, they were all talking about strange currents, unusually large disturbances in the water, and missing nets, sturdy, industrial-strength nets, ripped to shreds like confetti. Of course, the whisper of Old Man Tiber grew louder. Some claimed to have seen him, a fleeting glimpse of a dark, monstrous shape beneath the murky surface. I told myself it was just the heat playing tricks on their minds, but the seed of curiosity, that little fishing bug, had been planted. I decided I wanted to research. I took out my old maps, the ones my granddaddy used to have. They were filled with notes and marked locations of prime fishing spots. I scoured them, and the details that were drawn up matched all the old legends and sightings of Old Man Tiber, and discovered it all centered around a particularly deep bend in the river, known as the Devil's Elbow. The current there was treacherous, swirling around submerged trees and rock formations, creating a natural whirlpool. It had always been a dangerous spot, avoided by most fishermen. Of course, I was not most fishermen. For weeks, I researched and read, and asked all the local fishermen and historians about the legends of Old Man Tiber. I spent days studying the currents and mapping the underwater terrain with my old depth finder. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was something extraordinary lurking in those depths. Now, I'm not usually one for fancy equipment. I'm more of a hook, line, and sinker kind of guy. But if I was going after something legendary, I knew I needed to up my game. So I went down to Cletus's Bait and Tackle, the only decent shop for miles, and I told him my plan. Cletus, he was a grizzled old cuss, with a walleye-shaped birthmark on his cheek and a permanent smell of catfish stingbait clinging to him. He listened to my story with a skeptical glint in his eye. "Old man Tiber, huh? You gone loco, Jerry? That's just a myth, a story to scare greenhorns." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm going to find out for myself." Cletus chuckled, a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper rubbing against wood. "Well, if you're dead set on it, I reckon I can help you out. But don't come crying to me when that monster rips your arms off." He sold me the heaviest duty rod and reel he had, the kind used for deep-sea fishing. The line was braided steel, thick enough to tow a car. He even threw in a special, extra-large hook, one he swore was big enough to snag a small whale. For bait, I did some research. Some say that the old river monsters like the taste of bullhead catfish, and some say they like bluegill. I rigged my line up with a huge live bluegill, hooked right through the back, and added a massive weight to get it down to the bottom. The next morning, before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon, I loaded up the salty siren and headed towards the Devil's Elbow. The air was thick with humidity, and the mist hung low over the water, giving the river an eerie, almost primordial feel. As I approached the bend, I could feel the current tugging at the boat, a constant reminder of the power lurking beneath the surface. I found a relatively calm spot just outside the main whirlpool, anchored the boat as securely as I could, and dropped my line. The weight pulled the bait down quickly, disappearing into the murky depths. Then I waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the boat. Sweat dripped off my brow, stinging my eyes. I swigged sweet tea and battled mosquitoes, wondering if I was wasting my time. Maybe Cletus was right. Maybe old man Tiber was just a myth. Just as I was about to reel in my line and call it a day, something happened. The rod tip twitched, just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it happened again, a more pronounced tug. "It's on," I muttered, my voice trembling with excitement and a healthy dose of fear. I grabbed the rod, bracing myself. The line went taut, singing a high-pitched whine as something huge started pulling. This wasn't like any fish I'd ever caught before. It wasn't the sharp, erratic jerks of a bass or the steady pull of a gar. This was a slow, deliberate, unstoppable force. The boat lurched violently, nearly throwing me overboard. I gripped the sides, fighting to maintain my balance. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. I tightened the drag, but it barely slowed the beast down. "All right, you prehistoric son of a gun," I grunted, my muscles straining with the effort. "Let's see what you're made of." The battle was on. For what felt like an eternity, I fought that creature. It would pull, I would reel. It would dive, I would resist. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I refused to give up. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. This was about proving something to myself, about confronting the legend, about staring into the face of the unknown. The current was working against me, trying to drag the boat into the whirlpool. I fought to keep it pointed upstream, using the motor to compensate for the relentless pull. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the little boat into an oven. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to gain ground. The line tightened, the reel clattered, and I could feel the creature tiring. It wasn't giving up, but its movements were becoming less powerful, less deliberate. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally started to see something. A dark shape began to emerge from the depths, growing larger and larger as it neared the surface. My heart leaped into my throat. It was immense. I'm talking about a fish that dwarfed my boat. Its body was long and thick, covered in leathery, mottled brown skin. Its head was massive, with beady, ancient-looking eyes and a cavernous mouth that could swallow a basketball whole, and those whiskers. They were indeed like mooring ropes, thick and bristly, trailing in the water like seaweed. Old Man Tiber. He was real. I stared at him in awe and terror, a primal fear gripping me. This wasn't just a fish. It was a leviathan, a relic of a bygone era, a creature that had witnessed centuries of history unfold along the banks of the Mississippi. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, man and monster, separated by a thin line of braided steel. He looked at me with an ancient, unknowable gaze, his eyes reflecting the sunlight like polished obsidian. Then he made a move. With a sudden surge of power, he dove beneath the boat, pulling the line taut. The boat rocked violently, and I lost my footing, stumbling forward. In that moment of disarray, something snapped. Not the line, but something in me. I realized that I was in over my head. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a battle for survival. I reached for my knife, a trusty old Bowie that had been in my family for generations. With a deep breath, I sliced through the line. The sudden release of tension was almost deafening. The boat shuddered, then slowly righted itself. I watched as Old Man Tiber disappeared back into the depths, his massive form fading into the murky shadows. I sat there for a long time, panting, shaking, my body aching from the fight. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. I felt a mixture of relief, disappointment, and profound respect. I didn't catch Old Man Tiber, but I saw him. I felt his power. I knew that the legend was real. I reeled in the severed line, retrieving the broken end. As I examined it, I noticed something odd. The steel braid wasn't just cut. It was frayed almost, melted. It was as if something had burned through it with intense heat. I looked back towards the devil's elbow, a shiver running down my spine. Maybe Old Man Tiber was more than just a giant catfish. Maybe he was something else. I didn't fish the devil's elbow again for a long time. The memory of that encounter was too vivid, too unsettling. But the legend of Old Man Tiber never left me. Years later, I heard stories of other fishermen encountering him. Some claimed he was still guarding the depths of the Mississippi, a silent sentinel of the river. Others said he had moved on, seeking new territories, new waters to dominate. I don't know the truth, but I do know this. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to respect those mysteries and leave them undisturbed. As for the devil's elbow, well, it's still there, swirling and churning, a reminder of the day I came face to face with a legend. And every time I pass it, I can't help but wonder if Old Man Tiber is still lurking down there, waiting for the next unsuspecting fisherman to challenge his dominion. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. The salt hung thick in the air that day, just clinging to you like a second skin. I reckon it was late August, the kind where the sun beats down on the Gulf like a blacksmith's hammer, making the water shimmer and dance. Debbie, bless her heart, was back at the cabin, probably fussing over her begonias and getting ready for the next wave of travelers. I, on the other hand, was out there, me and my trusty boat, the salty dog, chasing the ever-elusive red drum. Now I've hooked a lot of red drum in my time, some real monsters, but this particular day felt different. It felt charged, like the air itself was humming with anticipation. I remember feeling an unusual calmness, a stillness that settled over me, like the morning mist over the bayou. Usually I'd be fidgeting, checking my lines, fussing with my bait, but that day I just let the boat drift, the rhythm of the waves rocking me into a peaceful trance. I wasn't using any fancy gear that day, just my old reliable rod, the one with the slightly worn cork grip, a simple weighted hook, and a chunk of fresh mullet. I've always been a believer in the power of simplicity, letting the fish do the talking, so to speak. Hours passed, and the sun started sinking, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A few smaller fish had nipped at my bait, but nothing of real interest. I was content, though, just enjoying the quiet solitude of the sea. Then it happened. The rod bent over like a willow in a hurricane. Not a sharp, jarring tug, but a slow, powerful pull, like something enormous had decided to explore the depths with my line. My heart jumped into my throat, and that calm I'd been feeling turned into a thrill that ran right down to my toes. I knew, in that instant, this was no ordinary fish. I set the hook, and the fight began, a battle of wills between man and beast that played out under the fading light. This wasn't a quick, erratic fight. It was slow, deliberate, the fish pulling me one way, me giving a little, then taking some line back. It felt like I was wrestling a submerged log, an ancient leviathan that had seen centuries of the ocean's secrets. Sweat beaded on my brow as I fought the fish. My arms ached. My back was screaming, but I couldn't give up. Not now. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. It was about something deeper, something primal. It was about the connection between a fisherman and the sea, a respect for the power that lay beneath the surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and I was fighting under the soft glow of the moon. The stars started to appear, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. I couldn't see the fish yet, but I could feel its immense power, its resilience. I started to think I might lose, but something deep inside me wouldn't let me quit. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a flash of silver in the moonlight, then another. I could make out the broad, powerful tail thrashing in the water as the fish broke the surface, its copper scales gleaming. It was the biggest red drum I'd ever seen, a true specimen, easily 70, maybe 80 pounds, maybe more. It looked like it could swallow my smallest dog whole. Slowly, carefully, I began to reel it in, the boat rocking with the strain. It was a delicate dance, a give and take, each movement calculated. I kept a steady hand, knowing that one wrong twitch could snap the line, or worse, break my heart. Finally, after what seemed like days, I managed to get the fish alongside the boat. I could see it clearly now, its big, soulful eye looking back at me. Now some might say I was foolish, But instead of pulling him aboard, something made me pause. I just stared at him, mesmerized. There he was, majestic and strong. I remember thinking about how many years he'd been swimming those currents, witnessing the ever-changing tides. I felt a profound respect for him, a kinship that went beyond the usual fisherman's pride. It was like I was seeing a part of myself reflected in his ancient eyes, a connection to the deeper rhythms of the universe that we all sometimes tend to forget. In that moment, the thrill of the catch faded. I knew that pulling him into the boat, taking him away from his home, just didn't feel right. So I did something I never usually do. I took my knife and carefully cut the line. I watched as the red drum paused for a moment, then, with a flick of its powerful tail, disappeared back into the darkness, sinking into the depths from whence he came. The line went slack, and the silence that followed felt both empty and profound. Now, most of the fellas from the docks would have called me a fool. They might have even laughed. Why would I release a fish like that? I could have bragged about it for years, but I didn't care. The memory of that encounter, that silent understanding between man and fish, was worth more than any trophy I could ever hang above my mantel. I pulled in my line, packed up my gear, and headed back to shore. Debbie was waiting for me, a worried look on her face, but I just smiled and told her, "I caught a big one, Debs, the biggest one I've ever seen." She asked how big in pounds, and I told her. "Oh dear," she said, "that would have been a great feast for the travelers." I just chuckled and said, "But this one, Debs, I'll remember forever." And you know what? I still remember it like it was yesterday. The salt, the sweat, the fight, the gentle release. That's the thing about fishing, friend. It's not just about the catch. It's about the journey. It's about the moments of quiet contemplation, the connection with nature, and sometimes it's about the ones that got away. And that, my friend, is a story I'll carry with me until the day the tide takes me away. Now, how about another glass of tea? Hope you're ready, because this next story's got a pull to it, just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. It must have been, late 80s, maybe early 90s. Yeah, early 90s, I reckon. I was younger then, of course, stronger, quicker. Still had all my hair then, too, though it was probably already starting to think about turning gray. Debbie and I, we were just getting settled into this place, and I was fishing like a man possessed. Didn't have the responsibility of running the cabin back then. Just me, the boat, and the open water. Pure freedom, that was. Now, you got to understand, back then, the fishing was different. Not better, not worse, just different. Regulations weren't as tight, and the fish, well, they seemed a little bigger, a little bolder maybe. Or maybe it was just me being younger and thinking everything was bigger back then. Could be that too. Anyway, I had this boat back then, a 23-foot Grady White. She was a beauty, that boat. The salty dog, I called her. Solid as a rock. Could handle anything the Gulf threw at her. I spent more time on that boat than I did on dry land some weeks, I swear. Used to head out before sunrise, come back long after dark, sometimes even stay out overnight if the fishing was good. Debbie, she'd worry herself sick sometimes, but she knew it was in my blood. Fishing, that is. It's more than just a hobby for me. It's part of who I am. Like breathing air, or feeling the sun on your face. So this particular trip, I was heading out for grouper. Now grouper, they're a bottom fish, big, strong, delicious eating, and a real challenge to catch. They live down deep, around reefs and wrecks, anywhere they can find cover. They're ambush predators, you see, lurk in the shadows, wait for a tasty snack to swim by, and then bam, they're on it. And once they're hooked, they'll head straight back down into their hole, try to break you off on the rocks or the wreck. You gotta be quick, gotta be strong, and gotta be smart to catch a big grouper. I had a spot I'd been fishing for years, about 30 miles offshore, an old sunken shrimp boat, down in maybe 80 feet of water. I'd caught some good fish there before, but nothing prepared me for what was waiting for me that day. The morning dawned crisp and clear, just the way I like it. Sunrise painting the sky in oranges and pinks, the air still cool and salty. The Gulf was almost flat calm, just a gentle swell rolling in. Perfect grouper weather, as we say. I had my gear all loaded up, my favorite heavy tackle rod and reel, spooled with strong braided line, and a cooler full of ice and bait. Mullet was the bait of choice that day. Nice and oily, grouper can't resist it. I got out to the spot just as the sun was climbing above the horizon. Used my GPS, fancy stuff for back then, but it was a lifesaver to pinpoint the wreck. Dropped anchor up current, letting the boat drift back over the spot. I like to fish with live bait when I can, but mullet chunks work just fine too, especially for grouper. I rigged up a heavy jig head, hooked a nice chunk of mullet on it, and dropped it down. Now, grouper fishing. It's not like trolling for mackerel or casting for redfish. It's mostly waiting. You drop your bait down, let it sink to the bottom, and then you just wait, feel for the bite. Sometimes it's a subtle tap, tap, tap. Other times it's like a freight train hitting your line. You never really know. I let my bait sink down, felt it thud against the bottom. Reeled up a couple of cranks to keep it just off the seabed, and then I waited. The gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the cries of the gulls overhead. It's a peaceful sort of waiting. Let you clear your head, think about things, or not think about anything at all. Just be present in the moment. After maybe 10 minutes, I felt a little twitch on my line, just a tiny little tug, like a nibble. Could have been a small snapper, could have been a trigger fish, could have been anything. I ignored it. Sometimes those little fish just mess with your bait. You gotta wait for the real deal. Then a few minutes later, another twitch. This time, a bit more insistent, like something was sniffing around, getting interested. My heart started to beat a little faster. Grouper? Maybe. Just maybe. I held my breath, my hand gripping the rod tight, feeling every vibration of the line. And then it happened. Wham! It was like the bottom of the ocean just exploded. The rod bent over double. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. This wasn't no little snapper. This was something big. Real big. Whoa! I yelled out loud, more to myself than anything else. Hang on tight, Jerry. The fish was pulling drag like crazy, heading straight down towards the wreck. I knew what it was trying to do. It was trying to get back into its hole, to rub the line against the sharp edges of the wreckage and break me off. If it made it down there, it would be game over. I tightened the drag on my reel as much as I dared. Didn't want to break the line, but I couldn't let it get down to the wreck either. It was a delicate balance. The rod was bowed almost to the breaking point. My arms were straining, my knuckles white as bone. This fish was strong, unbelievably strong. Stronger than any grouper I'd ever tangled with before, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. It was a straight up and down battle. Me against the fish, brute strength against brute strength. I was slowly, agonizingly gaining line. Inch by inch, foot by foot, I was pulling it up from the depths. But every foot I gained, it felt like it fought me back with two. My arms were burning, my back was aching, sweat was pouring down my face, even in the cool morning air. But I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not with a fish like this on the line. This was the kind of fish you dream about. The kind of fish that makes all those hours of waiting, all those empty trips, all worthwhile. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the screaming of the reel started to slow. The line angle started to change, pointing more towards the surface. I was gaining ground. I could feel the fish tiring just a little. Or maybe it was me who was tiring. I couldn't tell anymore. I kept pumping and reeling, slowly but surely bringing the fish up. My muscles were screaming. My hands were cramping, but adrenaline was coursing through my veins, keeping me going. I had to see this fish. I had to know what was on the end of that line. And then it started. A faint shimmer, deep down in the green water, a flash of white, and then slowly, majestically it began to rise. Bigger and bigger it grew as it came up from the depths. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary grouper. This was a monster. It broke the surface with a swirl of white water, and I finally got my first real look at it. It was a gag grouper, and it was enormous, bigger than any grouper I had ever seen or even heard of. Its body was thick as a barrel, its mouth like a bucket, its eyes cold and ancient. It looked like something out of a prehistoric age. I just stared at it, awestruck. For a moment, I almost forgot I was still hooked up to it. It was just magnificent, truly magnificent. But the fight wasn't over yet. The fish was still plenty strong, and it was still angry. It thrashed at the surface, sending spray flying, trying to shake the hook. I knew I had to get it alongside the boat, and fast, before it found a second wind, or before the hook pulled loose. Slowly, carefully, I worked it towards the boat. It was like trying to maneuver a small truck. Every move was deliberate. Every inch gained was hard fought. Finally, after what seemed like another eternity, I had it alongside. And that's when I realized I didn't have a net big enough. I didn't have a gaff big enough. Heck, I probably didn't have anything on board that was big enough to handle this fish. I was in trouble. I circled the fish, trying to figure out what to do. It was just lying there on the surface, its massive gills pumping, its dark eyes staring at me. It was exhausted, just like I was, but I knew it could still summon up a last burst of energy if it needed to. Then I had an idea, a crazy idea maybe, but it was the only one I had. I grabbed my heavy leader material, the stuff I used to make my bottom rigs, and tied a loop in the end, a big, strong loop. Then carefully, slowly, I leaned over the side of the boat, my heart pounding in my throat. I had to get that loop around the fish's tail. That was the only way I was going to get it into the boat. But getting close enough to that monstrous mouth, well, it made my skin crawl, just thinking about it. Taking a deep breath, I reached out with the loop. The fish didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was like it knew what I was trying to do. Slowly, carefully, inch by inch, I maneuvered the loop toward its tail. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the loop around its tail. Gently, I tightened it. Snug, but not too tight. I didn't want to hurt the fish, and I didn't want to spook it. Then, with a grunt and every ounce of strength I had left, I started to haul. It was like trying to lift a bag of cement out of the water. My muscles screamed. My back protested. My arms felt like they were going to rip out of their sockets. But I kept pulling. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to lift the fish's tail out of the water, then its body, then its massive head. It was a struggle, a desperate back-breaking struggle. But I was winning. Finally, with a last Herculean heave, I managed to swing the fish up and over the gunwale of the boat. It landed on the deck with a thud that shook the whole boat. And then it was done. It was in the boat. I had done it. I collapsed back against the console, gasping for breath, my body trembling, my hands shaking. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the fish, at this magnificent creature I had just wrestled from the depths. It was even bigger on deck than it had looked in the water. Truly a monster. After a few minutes, when my breathing started to return to normal, I got up and went over to the fish. It was still alive, its gills still pumping, but it was exhausted just like I was. I knelt down beside it and just looked at it, really looked at it, at its thick, powerful body, its ancient eyes, its massive mouth. It was a creature of the deep, a king of its domain, and I had, for a brief moment, matched wits with it and come out on top. A strange feeling washed over me. Pride, of course, but also respect and a little bit of sadness. Sadness that such a magnificent creature was now out of its element, out of its world. Sadness that its life, which had probably spanned decades, maybe even centuries, was now going to end. I knew I couldn't release it. Not after such a long fight. It was too exhausted, too stressed. It wouldn't survive. And besides, back then, regulations weren't what they are now. Catching a fish like this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a trophy, a story to tell for years to come. So with a heavy heart, but with a sense of awe and respect, I dispatched the grouper. It was quick and as humane as I could make it. Then I set about the task of getting it into the fish box. Even that was a struggle. It barely fit. I had to really cram it in there, and even then the tail was sticking out. The trip back to shore was, well, it was different. The boat felt heavier, more solid somehow, like it was carrying something truly significant. The sun was higher now. The day was getting hotter, but I hardly noticed. My mind was still back there, in the depths, battling that fish. When I got back to the dock, there were a few other fishermen around, cleaning their catches. As I pulled up, they all stopped what they were doing and stared. They saw the size of the fish in my boat, and their jaws just dropped. "Holy moly, Jerry, what in the world did you catch?" one of them asked, his eyes wide. "Grouper," I said, my voice still a little hoarse from yelling. "A big one." They came over to take a look, and a small crowd started to gather. Everyone was amazed. They'd never seen a grouper that big, never even heard of one that big. Word spread around the docks like wildfire. People came from all over, just to see it. We weighed it on the dock scales. It tipped the scales at Well, let's just say it was well over 100 pounds. Closer to 150 if I'm being honest. A true monster grouper. That fish, well, it fed us for weeks, and we shared it with all our friends and neighbors. It was the talk of the town for months. People still ask me about it sometimes, even now. Jerry, remember that giant grouper you caught back in the day? They always ask. And I always smile and say, yeah, I remember. How could I forget? Because you don't forget a fish like that. It's not just about the size, although that was impressive, sure. It's about the fight, the struggle, the connection you make with nature, with the raw power of the ocean. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.